So ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, welcome to this inaugural addresses of Professor Joanna Newman and Professor Laura Hammond. Inaugurals are a wonderful tradition. They are a rite of passage. And they are a rite of passage because you're invited by your peers to join the professorhood. And that they invite you not only because you've gone through some formal promotion process, but more so because they've made a judgment that your collective academic work now warrants you being invited into a select community of academics, those who've reached the pinnacle of the academic hierarchy. And so in a sense, inaugural addresses are very, very special events. But this rite of passage today, I think, needs to be celebrated for another reason. Because we live in a historical moment where the world of ideas and expertise is under attack. It's not only under attack in this country, it is under attack in many, many parts of the world, where the university and the craft of thinking through ideas and finding solutions, thinking through solutions to the challenges of our time is no longer regarded as something to be prized. And that is truly tragic. And it is particularly important that the world of the universities, the world of the academy, responds to that. And so in a sense, when today we have this inaugural addresses of two colleagues, both of whom work very close to me in the executive, what they're also doing is not speaking to the body of work that they've done. But what they are also doing is they are making a mark, a response from the academy to the people who attack the world of ideas. And so, no pressure, Joanna and Laura. This is a very special period, and I do want you to recognize it as such, but you also represent the whole of the academy in articulating your work on this evening tonight. And so with that, colleagues, we are going to kick off with Laura Hammond first, and our first testimonial speaker will be Dr. Oliver Bakewell, who will, of course, introduce Laura in a short while. Oliver Bakewell is a reader in migration studies at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. His work focuses on the intersections between migration and mobility and processes of development and change, with an empirical focus on migration within Africa. Much of his research has been focused on the Horn of Africa, looking at migration and development, the effects of externalization of EU migration policy, the relationship between migration, poverty and income inequality, transnational lived citizenship, and diaspora. From 2016 to the end of 2024, he was working closely with Laura in the Research and Evidence Facility of the EU Trust Fund for Africa, with a focus on the Horn of Africa. Prior to joining GDI, he was one of the founder members of the International Migration Institute at the University of Oxford, of which he then became director. Before taking up his role at Oxford, Oliver spent many years working with migrants and refugees, both as a researcher and a practitioner with a range of development and humanitarian NGOs. He holds a PhD and MSc in Development Studies from the University of Bath and a BA in Mathematics from the University of Cambridge. And so, colleagues, friends, Dr. Oliver Baker.
Thank you. I didn't expect you to read the whole thing out. So it's my great pleasure to be here today to offer this testimonial for the inaugural lecture of Professor Laura Hammond. I know I can't possibly do justice to her in the 5 minutes I've been allotted, so I'll simply offer some personal reflections. I first came across Laura's name back in 1996 when I was starting my own PhD on refugee repatriation. She was already writing conference papers from her own work on the subject, focusing on the Horn of Africa. And that raised in me this fear that she'd basically done the stuff and my PhD was going to be redundant. Instead, of course, she was providing lots of interesting ideas and debates that only stimulated my own research. It did mean she was on my list of contacts to meet when one of my first academic conferences was the Forced Migration Conference, which was held in East Jerusalem in 1998. And I did manage to find her there. And even from that first meeting, it was evident that Laura was already becoming an excellent model of an engaged academic. She was working on her PhD at the time at the University of Wisconsin, alongside regular consultancy for the UN Humanitarian Office, and I think probably others. A canny move, no doubt, that kept her in the financially afloat, and perhaps it may have slowed down the progress of her PhD. But I think possibly more importantly for her, it ensured that she could relate her academic findings and her research to the challenges facing people on the ground. And this cycle of exchange between academic policy and practice has continued throughout her career. She worked with many different forms of collaboration with a host of actors, including community organisations, non-governmental organisations, governments, donors, and UN bodies. I've been very fortunate to work with Laura on this EU-funded project, and I've seen firsthand how her approach, what she now refers to as her front-loaded advocacy, has enabled us to provide important critiques of policies, but also have an audience within the EU. She's adept at holding difficult conversations and managing challenging questions. Her close connection with the Horn of Africa, in particular Ethiopia and Somalia, and it's an approach, I realize she is very much, her work is on the Horn of Africa. She is the expert. If I do a bit of work in Ethiopia, but if anyone wants to really know anything, I'll say, well, you need to talk to Laura, because she knows her stuff there. She knows it intimately, and I think that really reflects her training as an anthropologist. So, from her work grounded in that, along with her concern to relate to academic analysis, to relate her academic analysis to improving the world, it's clearly informed the direction of her work over the years. From her earlier work thinking about the nature of home, thinking about what it means to return and how people become emplaced, thinking about the impact of humanitarian assistance, in particular food aid and the importance, food aid and the humanitarian system. She's been looking at the importance of transnational connections, the way that migrants and their descendants both send money, but also they have political influence in their countries of origin. She's been looking at the process of displacement, and more recently in the work I've been doing with her, the connection between migration, development and inequality. While empirical work has remained focused on the Horn, she's made a much wider academic contribution to our understanding of all these issues, seen in her many different publications. I've always admired Laura's skill in pulling out findings from a detailed study and communicating them to a diverse audience. She's a great public-facing intellectual, happy, or at least willing, to share her insights with the wider world, whether on the radio, TV, and in the wild world of social media. I believe she's now an ex-tweeter. I guess some of her practice for this has come from her teaching. She is an old school professor in the sense of sharing her knowledge with, I think, it must be hundreds of students over the years. I've lost count of the times, the number of times I've been in meetings with possibly a senior official of, whether it's in the UN, it's in an Ethiopian government department, wherever. So, it's a former student of mine. And they're all over the place. And she keeps coming across them, and she keeps contact with them. And I'm sure some of them, many of them are here this evening. And having been a friend and colleague of Laura's for many years, I can also testify to the kindness, patience, and grace in dealing with people, reflecting both her dealings with her students, but also so many other people, whether it's her peers, her students, the people she interviews, or any others. She's no fair-weather friend or colleague. She isn't building strategic relationships to further her career. She's establishing long-term connections. I looked back at the list of participants in that conference 27 years ago, where we first met. And many of the names of people I know she's still friends with today. I've benefited from her friendship and support as she's encouraged me to join projects, and I think many others can say the same. Seeing her in action as a project leader, I'm always impressed by her ability to keep calm, her gentle response when people fail to meet deadlines, I hope it's not just me, and imaginative response to steering things forward through any problems. I don't envy her current role in SOAS, in the executive. I'm delighted she's got it, and I think SOAS is lucky to have her. And I'm delighted to see that they're honouring her in this event. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing her lecture. So I finish by asking you to welcome Professor Laura Hammond.
Thank you. That was really lovely, Oliver, and it's really an honor to have you here this evening. As he says, we've gone through lots together, known each other a long time, and it's a testimony to our friendship that I managed to convince you to come tonight. I guess we're doing something right. But it's also really a pleasure to have so many of you here tonight who I've known for a very long time. Many of you have been part of the journey that I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes. And for that, I'll, in advance, thank you for the role that you've played in helping to shape me and my ideas and my approach to the work that I do, and myself as a person, really, honestly. I think that let me make sure that I know how this works. No, I obviously don't. Here we go. I'm going to do it old school, the way I used to do when I was a lecturer. I think that the brief of a lecture like this, I've discovered last night, it's a lot harder than it looks. So you're supposed to talk about the broad breadth of your career, which in my case is long. Let's be clear, I was promoted to professor 7 years ago, so I'm not a new professor. But you're supposed to talk about this broad range, a broad time period. You're supposed to speak to an audience that includes your academic colleagues, your former students, your current students, your family, your old friends as well, in a way that is going to bring everybody along with you. You're supposed to also somehow, in thinking about this broad historical reach of time, find the themes, the threads that somehow tie them all together to make it seem like it was all a great plan, that it all worked out in some kind of intentional way. When we know, social scientists know, that that's not the way life happens. It's all a big mess and a series of accidents, and in retrospect, you make it make sense and you pull a narrative out of it. So that is what I've tried to do tonight, and apologies if it doesn't work out that well. So here are my key themes that I think that probably sum up a lot of what I've been doing, probably not all of it, but some of it, and what I want to speak about tonight. So the first is that in a lot of the work that I do has to do with migration, displacement. I also do a lot of research on food security, on conflict, on humanitarian affairs and humanitarian assistance. And I've taught classes on famine and food security, refugees and forced displacement. And I always say to my students on the first day, this is not about studying the way that people suffer. It's about studying the enormous creativity and improvisation and innovation, ingenuity that people have. And it's really about survival, how people survive quite difficult times for sure, but it's really a study of survival, not of suffering. And so hopefully that comes through in all of the work that I've done. The second piece is in the work that I do on migration and mobility, to think about the centrality of mobility to our socioeconomic life. I'm a migrant. Many of you, probably I would say most of you in this room, are migrants of some sort. And that's just how life happens. We all move around the world, and some of us move more easily than others. Some of us, unfortunately, are unable to move when we should be able to move. But we really need to think about the centrality of mobility, and not as an exception of life, of what sort of something that happens outside of life, but as a central way that life actually happens. The third piece is around trying to address this increasingly pernicious narrative that we see in popular press, and as well now in governmental speech, and I dare say, unfortunately, in popular speech, about the nature of migration as problematic, and therefore migrants as problematic, migrants as needing to be stopped or held in place or pushed back. And so a lot of the work that I do is really trying to look at other ways of understanding migration, and I'll explain that in a minute. As Oliver said, I do a lot of work, a lot of my research, and I think one of the great things about SOAS is that a lot of the work that we do here is unabashedly aims to try to create a better something, a better life, a better world, a better situation in whatever we're studying. And so for me, that means with migration, trying to think about the importance of a more holistic understanding of people moving and how they move and why they move, rather than having a sort of siloed perspective on migration. So very often, if you go to humanitarian sort of country offices, you'll find the migration expert or the migration team, when in fact what we want to see and what we're pushing for in a lot of the work that we're doing, including a book that I've just finished with Oliver and Padmini, who's sitting here, and others who are not here tonight, has been to try to argue that we need a much more broad, holistic approach to understanding development that includes at its core the way people move. And then finally, I'll just say something about equitable research partnerships, and that's kind of in my current job now, something that I really feel very passionately about for SOAS as an institution, but it comes out of the research that I've done, and hopefully in a few of this, I'm going to take you on a very whistle-stop tour of the Horn of Africa. You'll see why and how that has become to be so important to me. So here we are, going to start off in Ethiopia, where I started my first research in the early 1990s. I was in Tigray, which is in the northern part of Ethiopia, the circled area there. And I did my PhD research in the far northwest corner, near a town called Humera, in a settlement for returned refugees who had come back from Sudan after the end of the civil war of the 1970s and 80s and the famine of 1984-85. They were the kind of We Are the World sort of inspiration, if you like, but most of them didn't know that. And they came back at the end of the Civil War in the early 1990s and were established in these western lowland areas. And so I spent 20 months of field work trying to understand what is the process of homecoming. How does one come to create a new sense of home, having lived for 10 years in a refugee camp, having come back to a place that is not the place they originally were displaced. They were coming from, originally they had lived in the central and eastern zones for the most part. And so they were living in a new agroecological zone. They had to grow different crops. They had different kinds of challenges. And so what was that whole process of homecoming? And so that took me to write a dissertation and ultimately a book, which is called This Place Will Become Home. And it really looks at, again, this is where the sort of focus on adaptation, innovation, creativity, resilience, if you like that word, I don't like it, but it's often used. The term that, the idea that people are always constantly doing something to try to help themselves, to get themselves established, to take care of their families, they're not sitting waiting for humanitarian assistance, thank goodness, because they would perish if they did. But it's about that hive of activity that goes around with what happens when people move from one place to another. And in unpicking that and trying to work with this community, which was about 7,000 people, I found that those processes of placemaking and emplacement were very much determined by gender. Men and women obviously experienced those processes in very different ways. also by generation, so younger people, middle-aged people, parents of young children had a very different experience from those who were older, and very different objectives of what they wanted out of their lives as well. But for all of these people, the process of homemaking came about through a constant interaction in very concrete, practical ways with their environment, in the renegotiation of what might be called unknown space or wilderness, and recoding it or learning about it so that it became seen as safe, and therefore that you feel you belong to it because it is your place, and it's a place that makes you feel safe. So this was a kind of a long-term kind of piece of work that I did then, and it was all about when will people come to feel home. And unfortunately, then in 2020, people who lived in this place were displaced again. Half of them went back into Sudan. Half of them moved further east to the central and eastern parts of Tigray. And so I've now, as I'll come back to in a few minutes, have returned to thinking much more about these processes of when does homecoming actually happen, when you can be uprooted again many years later. So in some of the work, I was the worst PhD student. I did my PhD field work, and then I stayed in Ethiopia for 5 years. I did things like teach at the university. Tasso sitting there was one of my students for a short period of time. I worked for different NGOs and UN agencies. I got this ridiculous award, which has sat in my basement for 20 years. But now, with the evisceration of USAID and its co-optation by the State Department, I'd thought that as an act of resistance, I would pull it out for you, which is an award that I got from working with a fantastic group of people, some of whom became my students later, and who were really seized with the importance of connecting research with action to try to prevent famine from taking place in 1999 and 2000. And apparently the State Department thought we were successful because they gave us this award. But that's not the point. The point being that it was the value of that was about learning to work in different kinds of groups together, learning to share my research with the work of policymakers and other kind of people who were involved in making things actually happen, so that my research could actually play a role in making things actually happen. And that was carried out in the context of famine early warning and internal resettlement in Ethiopia, and as well conflict-induced displacement. And so that kind of commitment to sort of action-oriented research, which I kind of sometimes call myself a practitioner academic without wanting to belittle either side of those things, is something that I've kind of kept with me for a long part of this journey. Moving right on our whistle-stop tour to Somaliland, and I'm really delighted to have my Somaliland friends here tonight. So I, in the late 1990s, went to Somaliland, and I worked in the Ministry of Planning and for the minister there as an advisor, which is a bit silly because I really was unqualified to do that. But I was paid by UNDP to help think about strategies of helping refugees who were coming back from Ethiopia at that time to Somaliland to find a way of establishing themselves. So kind of similar questions, very different kind of population, but again, a post-war kind of context in which people were coming back and trying to make the most of what that homecoming looked like. And I didn't have the luxury of being able to do as in-depth research as I had at that point, but I did get to start some research that's been going on for many years since then. And one piece of that has been trying to understand urban displacement in particular ways. This is an aerial photo of the State House area of Hargeisa. Hargeisa is the capital city of Somaliland, and the State House is where the former British kind of colonial administration is, in this little spot right there. And this photograph was taken in 2002 after many people had returned from Ethiopia at the end of the Civil War and were starting to establish themselves. It's right in the middle of the city, and it's on prime real estate. And yet they had come back to Somaliland finding that they weren't able to go back to their homes for whatever reason. They sort of remained displaced yet home at the same time. And then if you consider this photo, which was taken in 2018, same exact spot, exactly the same spot. You can see how incredibly crowded it has become, how much more populated it has become, with not just people coming from Ethiopia, but also people who've been displaced from rural areas as a result of increasing frequency of drought, the inability to support themselves in rural livelihoods, people pouring into the cities. And this remains a huge challenge for urban planning, as well as for the people who live there, of course, to try to figure out how best to respond to the challenges of a growing urban population without creating a magnet effect such that everybody comes pouring in, more people come pouring in. But the themes that come out of this research, again, go back to the idea of creativity, of the importance of people's own innovation and their own kind of desire to make something of themselves despite the challenges that they face. They had very minimal assistance throughout this process, and what survival they've been able to achieve has been solely on their own backs. This also took me to do a lot of research on the relations between urban and rural economies. So even though people have moved into the cities, they have not entirely, in most cases, forsaken the rural economy. So they maintain ties to farms and relatives who remain in the rural areas, and goods and people and money goes back and forth into kind of collapsing the ideas that we have about what's an urban economy and a rural economy. This research also brought me into doing more work on remittances, and I'll come back to that in just a second. So this is an up-close picture of State House, people living in the shadow of the State House. But I also wanted to mention, because there's an exhibition going on just in this same building now, Positive Negatives exhibition on stories of migration, to highlight some work that I did together with Ben Dix, who runs Positive Negatives, where we did some research in Somaliland, and we gathered some of the personal stories of people who'd been displaced to try to understand what has been that experience of moving out of rural areas into the peripheries of the cities, where people are then kind of unable to get fully integrated into the cities themselves. And so we have this woman who we've called Halgan, who told us her story. Ben's colleagues turned it into a graphic story, and we were able to bring it back to her, and she was the celebrity for the day. But that work has been also kind of touches on one of the themes I raised about equitable research partnerships. So in this work, we worked really closely with colleagues from the University of Hargeisa, with students and with staff, and that was a really rewarding experience for us and for them. Many of the students had no idea that people with these kinds of experiences were living in their own city, and so they were able to understand their own environment in different ways. I'll have to put this photo up here because my dear friend Edna is here tonight. Edna was my landlady when I first moved to Hargeisa in 1997. She was former Minister of Foreign Affairs for Somaliland as well. She now runs what I would say is the best maternity hospital in the region that she founded with her own pension money after having retired from WHO. Shout out to WHO again. And I have the privilege and the honor of chairing her Board of Trustees for the Edna Aden Foundation here in the UK. Lee Castanelli, who's here tonight, leads the US version of that charity, and it's been an honor and a privilege to be able to do that, mostly because of the amazing work that hospital does, but also because it's given me a really valuable avenue of being able to interact on a way that's, I hope, is not extractive, in a way of giving back to the people who have given me so much through this long research experience, to be able to make a contribution in that way to what goes on in Somaliland has been really a great privilege, and so thank you to Edna and to all of your colleagues. I'm probably almost running out of time, but I'm making good progress here in my whistle-stop tour. Now I'm going to pan out a bit. So some of the work that we did in Somaliland revolved around the importance of remittances, and so that led me to think more broadly about the other side of the remittance chain, if you like. So not only what do people do with remittance money that they receive and support they receive on the ground, but also who are those people who are sending money on the other side. And so I've done work in Lewiston, Maine. When I first started my academic career at Clark University, I worked with another old friend of ours who recently passed away, Dick Ford, and we went to Lewiston and worked with a community Somalis who had all moved in during a very short period of time to this one community that had no experience whatsoever with communities that were any more different than French Canadian. So they were in a kind of state of not knowing what to do, and we developed a community action plan together with them. And then more recently, I worked on a project with colleagues from UCL and Queen Mary, University of London, on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on migrant communities from Somalia, India, and Brazil. And we did some really great work in Cardiff with the Somali community there, and tried to understand not only what is the impact of the pandemic on these communities, but also the ways in which the long-standing structural inequalities that have built up since, in the Cardiff case, for the last 100 years, there's been a Somali community there. And there's been this widening gulf of inequality that has disadvantaged them already before the pandemic came along. And the pandemic, of course, just preyed on those inequalities and pried them open even more. And so that research was really important and great to work on, and great to work with the community groups that were there. So again, another form of partnership that I have really learned from quite a lot. The last piece I'm going to talk about is the recent 8 years of research that we worked on with the Research and Evidence Facility. And it was a huge project, 6.5 million euros, 30 different studies, 7 different countries. We worked with 70 different researchers at least, I think more than that, from across the region. We had a fantastic team of people based in Nairobi. Padmina was one of the directors of that team. And so rather than a specific project, it was more a sort of series of different kinds of projects. But we were looking at trying to understand, just generally speaking, the big question was how are migration and development related to each other, and how are investments by the European Union, who spent more than 2.5 billion euros over 10 years in this region, how is that changing the dynamics of the migration and movement and people's thinking about migration and movement in the region? So I'd have to talk for 3 hours about all the different work that we did, but we tried in some ways to shift the dial and shift some of the narratives and conversations that were going on within the European Union about the importance of migration. A lot of people were just focused on, is the number going up or down? And we would say, well, that's not really the most interesting question or the most important question. The important question is, are people safer? Do they have the choice to be able to go to this place or that place? Are they being forced to move? Are they becoming unsafe through the journey itself? Those are the kinds of things that we see that are problematic. And the fact that people are moving within the Horn of Africa is really not a problem, because they have been doing so for hundreds of years. You'd think that's a pretty basic point, but you'd be surprised how many times you have to say it in different ways. And so the kinds of, I won't go through all of these different sort of kinds of recommendations, but some of the key points that came out of this broad piece of work of all these different 30 studies was an overriding insistence on the importance of mobility as being an essential element of social life, trying to get that recognized, trying to get it integrated more into the way that development thinking and policy and funding is done, not just by the European Union, but by the UN, by governments themselves, by employers, by whoever. And also, so that was kind of one key theme. Another was to really try to steer the attention away from the idea of migration as problematic, to say it's really displacement, unsafe movement, forced movement that is problematic. And the rest of it, in a sense, is just what people will do. And actually, as we learned through the COVID pandemic, it's important that people are able to move, because when they can't move, they can't find jobs, they can't go to markets, they can't take care of their families, and that's when problems start to arise. So really important. And as maybe an example of that would be the huge disjuncture we found between migration, mobility thinking and planning and policy making and climate policy, where in the Horn of Africa it's quite surprising, because the main way that people respond to the challenges of climate change is by moving. They move from their farms, which are no longer productive, to the cities, which can hopefully support them. But there's hardly any conversation about the relationship between the two of them. So a lot of our work has been trying to bring those two things together. So finally, I want to end on this recent work that I've been just embarking on together with Daniel Mulugeta, who's here, and other colleagues. It's a partnership with Mekelle University and Adigrat University back in Tigray, where I started off the research. So it's very nice that it all comes full circle, and it was not intended that way. It was totally accidental. But these are two universities that have suffered through the worst of the worst kind of war between 2020 and 2022. And the staff members that we're working with are academics who were trained in conflict and peace prevention before the war came and turned everything upside down for them. And now, by their own admission, they say our biggest challenge right now is that we all suffer from trauma and our students suffer from trauma, and we're not even sure where to pick up the pieces to start moving ahead as academics, as professionals, as teachers, as people as well. And so we're doing a project for a year trying to help them think about and unpack their own stories so that they are in a better place, hopefully, to provide leadership within their communities and within their universities. And that, to me, is kind of, in a sense, takes it full circle, because it's really been about developing those relationships and those partnerships and helping to amplify, in some cases, the voices of those who very often don't have the same kind of platforms that some of us are very privileged to be able to have. And so, for me, this work is among some of the most important work that I've really ever done. So I just wanted to end it there, but thank you very much for all of the support that all of you have been giving to me over this many years. Apologies to those of you who've had to be my students and have had to, I think Oliver, you was very kindly didn't call me a bottleneck tonight, but he often does call me a bottleneck because I'm slow at getting things back to people, so apologies for all of that. But yeah, I hope you all have a nice evening. Thank you.